Hello everyone. Welcome to the Boring History channel. Tonight, imagine yourself walking alone through a medieval road, where the darkness is so deep it feels alive, and every distant footstep could mean help, or something far worse. Why did people fear strangers so deeply after sunset? What hidden dangers turned a simple encounter into a life or death decision? In this quiet journey, we'll uncover the unsettling truth behind trust, survival, and the shadows of the past. So dim the lights, relax, and let the story slowly unfold. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories shared here. And do comment from where you're watching this video. In the stillness of a medieval night, when darkness swallowed the last traces of sunlight and the world retreated into shadow, the line between safety and danger became dangerously thin, and trusting a stranger could mean the difference between survival and disappearance. Unlike the modern world, where streetlights, communication systems, and organized law enforcement create a fragile but real sense of security, medieval societies were built upon uncertainty, isolation, and vulnerability, especially after dusk. Roads were often nothing more than dirt paths cutting through dense forests or barren fields, unlit and unguarded, where a single wrong encounter could go unseen and unpunished. Travellers moved cautiously during the day, but at night only the desperate, the lost, or the dangerous ventured out. This alone created an unspoken rule. Anyone you met after dark was not there by accident, and their intentions were rarely innocent. Bandits and highwaymen thrived in such conditions, using the cover of night to ambush merchants, pilgrims, or lone wanderers, stripping them not only of their possessions, but often their lives. There were no immediate authorities to call upon, no nearby help, and even if one managed to escape, the chances of identifying or tracking the attacker were almost non-existent. Trust, therefore, was not a virtue, but a liability. Beyond common thieves, there were mercenaries, deserters, and fugitives who roamed the countryside, blending into the shadows, often posing as harmless travellers to lower the guard of their victims. A friendly greeting, a request for directions, or an offer to share warmth by a fire could quickly turn into betrayal. Moreover, medieval societies were deeply superstitious, and the night was believed to belong not just to criminals but to darker forces. Witches, spirits, and unknown entities whispered about in folklore. While some of these fears were exaggerated, they reinforced a cultural instinct to avoid unfamiliar encounters after sunset. Villages would lock their gates, households would bar their doors, and anyone knocking late at night was treated with suspicion rather than hospitality. Even within towns, where walls provided a semblance of protection, the streets became dangerous once the curfew bells rang. Guards were limited, corruption was not uncommon, and criminals often operated with impunity in poorly monitored areas. Inns, which served as safe havens for travellers, could themselves become traps if run by unscrupulous hosts who collaborated with thieves or exploited their guests. Poisoning, theft, and even murder within such establishments were not unheard of, especially when outsiders carried goods or coin. The lack of identification systems made it easy for anyone to fabricate a story, assume a false identity, or disappear without consequence. In such an environment, trust had to be earned over time, not given freely in fleeting encounters, particularly in the obscurity of night. Communication barriers added another layer of risk. Dialects varied widely, and misunderstandings could escalate quickly into conflict. A stranger's intentions, tone, or words could be misinterpreted, leading to tension or violence. Furthermore, the concept of justice was localized and inconsistent. What was considered a crime in one region might be overlooked in another, and outsiders often had fewer rights or protections. This meant that even if a stranger seemed harmless, there was no guarantee of shared moral codes or accountability. Survival instincts dictated caution, encouraging individuals to rely only on known companions or avoid travel altogether after dark. The physical environment itself compounded these dangers. Dense forests provided hiding places, while uneven terrain increased the likelihood of accidents or ambushes. Torches and lanterns offered limited visibility, often revealing one's own position more than that of a lurking threat. Every sound, rustling leaves, distant footsteps, or a snapping twig could signal danger, heightening paranoia and reinforcing the instinct to avoid unknown figures. In such conditions, a stranger approaching in the night was not just an individual, but a potential threat shaped by a world where lawlessness, desperation, and survival intertwined. Even acts of kindness could carry hidden motives, as scarcity often drove people to extreme measures. Food, money, and shelter were valuable commodities, and those lacking them might resort to deception or violence to obtain them. Trusting someone without knowing their background, affiliations, or intentions was a gamble few could afford. Over time, these realities shaped a cultural mindset that equated caution with wisdom and suspicion with survival. Stories passed down through generations warned of travelers who trusted too easily and paid the ultimate price, reinforcing a collective understanding that night was not a time for openness, but for vigilance. In essence, the medieval night was a realm where uncertainty ruled, and strangers embodied that uncertainty in its most immediate form, trust. In such a setting, was not a sign of kindness, but a dangerous risk, one that could strip away not only possessions, but life itself, leaving behind nothing but silence in the darkness where no one would hear or remember what truly happened. As the last embers of daylight faded behind the horizon in medieval times, the transformation of the world was not merely visual but psychological, turning familiar paths into corridors of uncertainty and reshaping ordinary people into potential threats. For night concealed identity, intention and consequence in equal measure. In an age where even daylight offered no guarantees of safety, darkness amplified every existing danger and introduced new ones, making the act of trusting a stranger not just naive, but potentially fatal. The medieval landscape lacked the infrastructure that modern societies take for granted. There were no illuminated streets, no patrol vehicles, no instant communication, and no standardized systems of law enforcement capable of responding swiftly to distress. Instead, authority was fragmented, often confined to small regions controlled by local lords, whose influence rarely extended beyond their immediate domain, leaving vast stretches of land effectively lawless once the sun set. Travelers caught outside these protected zones at night were entirely on their own, and any stranger they encountered was similarly unbound by oversight, operating within a space where consequences were distant and uncertain. This absence of accountability created fertile ground for deception, where appearances could not be trusted, and even the most harmless seeming individual might conceal desperation or malicious intent beneath a veneer of civility. A man asking for directions might be scouting his next victim. A weary traveler seeking shelter might be part of a larger group waiting in ambush. And a seemingly kind companion offering to share a fire could be calculating the moment to strike when vigilance waned. The darkness itself became an accomplice to such acts, erasing details, muffling sounds, and ensuring that witnesses were rare or non-existent. Beyond human threats, the medieval mindset was deeply shaped by uncertainty and fear of the unknown, further discouraging trust in strangers at night. Without scientific understanding of many natural phenomena, unexplained events were often attributed to supernatural forces, and the night was widely believed to be the domain of spirits, demons, and other malevolent entities. While modern readers may interpret these beliefs as superstition, they played a crucial role in reinforcing caution, as the inability to distinguish between natural and unnatural dangers blurred the boundaries of trust even further. A stranger encountered in darkness was not just a person but a symbol of the unknown, and in a world where the unknown frequently meant danger, instinct dictated avoidance rather than engagement. Villages and towns reflected this collective caution through strict practices. Gates were shut at dusk, entry was limited or denied to latecomers, and those who arrived after hours were often left outside the walls, regardless of their pleas, because the risk of admitting a threat outweighed the moral impulse to help. Even within households, doors were barred and windows secured, and a knock in the night was more likely to be met with silence than with welcome, as trust required familiarity, and familiarity could not be established in the fleeting, uncertain encounter of darkness. Economic hardship also played a significant role in shaping these attitudes, as scarcity was a constant reality for many people in medieval society. Resources such as food, money, and shelter were not guaranteed, and survival often depended on securing these necessities by any means available. In such an environment, desperation could drive individuals to commit acts they might otherwise avoid, blurring moral boundaries and making it difficult to predict behavior based solely on appearance or demeanor. A stranger encountered at night might not inherently be a criminal, but hunger, fear, or necessity could push them toward harmful actions, especially when the likelihood of being caught was minimal. This unpredictability made trust a dangerous gamble, as even those with no initial ill intent could become threats under the right circumstances. Furthermore, the lack of reliable identification systems meant that individuals could easily fabricate identities, invent stories, or conceal their past, making it impossible to verify who someone truly was or what they were capable of. Reputation, which served as a form of social currency within communities, had little value in interactions with strangers, particularly those encountered far from their place of origin. The physical environment of medieval Europe and other regions added yet another layer of risk. And as the medieval night deepened into its most silent and oppressive hours, another layer of danger revealed itself, not just in the presence of strangers, but in the complete absence of structure that governed human behavior after dusk, where morality itself could become flexible under the cloak of anonymity. In daylight, people were bound, at least loosely, by social visibility. Actions were seen, judged and remembered. But at night, especially beyond the reach of village centres or guarded towns, identity dissolved into shadow, and with it, the fear of consequence weakened. A stranger in the night was not simply unknown. They were untraceable, unaccountable, and in many ways invisible to the systems that might otherwise restrain them. This made even a brief interaction inherently risky, because there was no reliable way to ensure that what you saw was what truly existed. A soft-spoken voice could mask aggression. A humble posture could conceal strength. And a plea for help could be nothing more than a calculated tactic designed to lower defenses. Deception thrived in darkness, not only because it was easier to execute, but because it was harder to detect, turning every encounter into a psychological gamble where the stakes were extraordinarily high. Compounding this danger was the fact that medieval travel itself was often a matter of necessity rather than choice, forcing individuals into situations where they had to weigh immediate needs against potential risks. Pilgrims journeying to sacred sites, merchants transporting goods, messengers carrying important information, and even fugitives escaping justice all shared the same roads, often indistinguishable from one another in the dark. This blending of intentions created an environment where trust could not be based on appearance or stated purpose alone, as each role could be imitated or fabricated with ease. A person claiming to be a pilgrim might be using that identity as a shield, knowing that it invoked sympathy and reduced suspicion, while in reality they might be scouting opportunities for theft or worse. Similarly, groups of travelers could present themselves as companions for safety, only to turn against one another when the opportunity arose, especially if valuable goods or resources were involved. The lack of formal systems to verify such claims meant that every interaction required a level of judgment that was difficult to exercise accurately under conditions of fatigue, fear, and limited visibility. The role of alcohol and exhaustion cannot be overlooked either, as both were common factors influencing behavior during medieval nights. Taverns and inns, while providing essential rest stops, were also places where judgment could be impaired, and conflicts could escalate quickly. A stranger encountered after leaving such an establishment might not be in full control of their actions, increasing the unpredictability of the situation. Intoxication could turn minor misunderstandings into violent altercations, and exhaustion could dull one's instincts, making it easier to overlook warning signs or react too slowly to emerging threats. In such states, even individuals who might otherwise act with caution could make decisions they would later regret, if they survived to reflect on them at all. This further reinforced the idea that night was not merely a continuation of day, but a fundamentally altered state of existence, where the usual rules of interaction no longer applied, and where trust became exponentially more dangerous. Another critical aspect was the absence of medical knowledge and emergency care, which made even non-lethal encounters potentially fatal. A simple injury sustained during a confrontation, whether from a weapon, a fall, or an attempt to escape, could lead to infection, blood loss, or long-term disability with little chance of effective treatment. This meant that the consequences of trusting the wrong person extended far beyond the immediate moment, potentially resulting in prolonged suffering or death days or weeks later. The risk was not just in being attacked, but in the inability to recover from the aftermath, making prevention the only reliable form of protection. Avoiding strangers at night was therefore not just about evading immediate danger, but about preserving one's overall chances of survival in a world where recovery was uncertain and often unlikely. Even the concept of time contributed to the unease surrounding nighttime encounters, as the lack of precise timekeeping made it difficult to gauge how long one had been travelling or how far one remained from safety. This disorientation could lead individuals to make desperate decisions, such as trusting a stranger who claimed to know a shortcut or offering guidance to a nearby settlement. In reality, such claims could lead victims deeper into isolation, away from any potential help, and into situations where escape became increasingly difficult. The psychological pressure of being lost or uncertain could override cautious instincts, making people more susceptible to manipulation and false promises. A stranger who appeared confident and knowledgeable could exploit this vulnerability, presenting themselves as a solution while actually being the source of greater danger. Furthermore, the hierarchical and often rigid social systems of the medieval world meant that not all lives were valued equally, and this disparity influenced how strangers were perceived and treated. Individuals of lower status, peasants, labourers, or those without clear affiliations, were more likely to be viewed with suspicion and less likely to receive assistance, while those of higher status might attract attention precisely because of their perceived wealth or importance. This imbalance created additional layers of risk, as interactions between strangers could be influenced by assumptions about status, leading to either misplaced trust or targeted exploitation. A well-dressed traveller might be seen as an opportunity for gain, while a poorly dressed one might be dismissed as a potential threat, regardless of their true intentions. In both cases, the inability to accurately assess the situation increased the likelihood of harmful outcomes. Over generations, these experiences coalesced into a form of collective wisdom that emphasized vigilance above all else, particularly in the context of nighttime encounters. Stories of betrayal, ambush, and disappearance were not merely cautionary tales, but reflections of a reality that people understood through direct or indirect experience. Parents warned their children, travelers shared advice, and communities reinforced boundaries, all contributing to a cultural framework that prioritized self-preservation over openness when the sun went down. Trust was not eliminated, but it was carefully rationed, extended only to those who had proven themselves over time and within the safety of known environments. A stranger in the night, lacking both familiarity and context, simply did not meet the criteria required to earn that trust. In the end, the medieval night was a convergence of physical darkness, social uncertainty, and psychological tension, creating conditions where even the smallest misjudgment could have irreversible consequences. To trust a stranger in such an environment was to ignore the accumulated knowledge of countless others who had faced similar choices and suffered the outcomes of misplaced faith. It was not that every stranger intended harm, but that the cost of being wrong was too great to justify the risk. And so the instinct to avoid, to withdraw, and to remain guarded became not just a habit, but a necessity, shaping behavior in ways that ensured survival in a world where the unknown was not an abstract concept, but a very real and immediate threat lurking just beyond the reach of firelight. As the hours crept toward the deepest part of the night, when even the most vigilant guards struggled to keep their eyes open, and the world seemed suspended in an uneasy stillness. The dangers associated with strangers became even more pronounced, not only because of what could be seen or heard, but because of what could not. In medieval times, silence itself was often a warning sign, a void that concealed movement, intention, and presence until it was too late to react. A stranger emerging from that silence carried with them an unpredictability that no amount of intuition could fully decipher, because the context needed to understand them simply did not exist. There were no records to consult, no quick way to verify identity, no shared systems of trust that extended beyond immediate communities. Each encounter was isolated, disconnected from any larger framework that might provide reassurance, making every decision rely heavily on instinct, which, under the strain of darkness and fear, could easily falter. This isolation amplified the psychological weight of every interaction, turning even a brief exchange into a moment charged with potential danger. The architecture and layout of medieval settlements further contributed to this atmosphere of distrust, particularly at night. Narrow alleys, uneven streets, and tightly packed buildings created countless blind spots where individuals could hide or move unnoticed. A stranger encountered in such an environment could disappear within seconds, only to reappear at a more advantageous moment, or not at all, leaving behind uncertainty and unease. The lack of organized urban planning meant that even within towns, one could quickly become disoriented after dark, especially if unfamiliar with the area. This disorientation could be exploited by those who knew the terrain, allowing them to guide, mislead, or trap unsuspecting individuals with relative ease. Trusting a stranger who claimed familiarity with the surroundings was therefore a significant risk, as it placed control of one's movement and safety into unknown hands. As the first faint hints of dawn threatened the horizon, there remained a final, often overlooked dimension to the danger of trusting strangers at night in medieval times: the irreversible nature of consequences in a world that lacked the mechanisms to correct mistakes. In modern settings, errors in judgment can sometimes be mitigated through intervention, communication, or institutional support. But in the medieval night, a single misstep could not be undone. There were no emergency responders to arrive, no reliable witnesses to recount events, and no structured investigations to seek justice. If a stranger chose to harm, deceive, or abandon someone, the aftermath often vanished into obscurity, leaving behind no trace except the absence of the victim. This permanence made every decision heavier, every interaction more significant, and every act of trust a potential point of no return. The weight of this reality shaped behavior in ways that emphasized prevention over reaction, because once something went wrong, there was rarely an opportunity to set it right. The concept of memory and oral tradition further amplified the fear surrounding such encounters, as communities relied heavily on shared stories to pass down knowledge and warnings. These stories were not merely exaggerated tales meant to frighten, but reflections of real experiences filtered through generations, each retelling reinforcing the underlying message that the night was unforgiving, and that strangers within it were unpredictable at best and dangerous at worst. Accounts of travellers who vanished without explanation, of merchants who never reached their destinations, or of individuals who were last seen speaking to someone unknown, became part of a collective narrative that shaped how people perceived risk. Even if the details were not always accurate, the pattern they conveyed was clear enough to influence behavior. Trust given too easily in the wrong moment could lead to outcomes that no one could later explain or rectify. Another crucial factor was the absence of shared accountability across regions, which meant that a stranger encountered at night might not only be unknown, but also completely detached from any system of responsibility that could hold them accountable for their actions. Medieval territories were often fragmented into small jurisdictions, each with its own rules, authorities, and limitations. A person could commit a harmful act in one area and simply move to another, effectively escaping any consequences, especially if the incident occurred in isolation with no witnesses. This mobility allowed individuals with harmful intent to operate with a degree of freedom that made them particularly dangerous, as they could exploit the gaps between jurisdictions and the lack of coordinated enforcement. Trusting such a person, even briefly, meant engaging with someone who might have no ties to the community, no fear of reprisal, and no intention of maintaining any form of moral or legal obligation. The role of instinct in these situations was both vital and unreliable, creating a paradox that further complicated decisions about trust. On one hand, people relied heavily on their intuition to assess danger, especially in the absence of concrete information. On the other hand, the conditions of the night, darkness, fatigue, fear, could distort perception and lead to false conclusions. A person might feel reassured by a stranger's calm demeanor or familiar manner of speaking, interpreting these as signs of safety, when in reality they were carefully crafted signals designed to evoke exactly that response. Conversely, someone with genuine intentions might appear suspicious simply because of the circumstances, leading to missed opportunities for safe interaction. This inconsistency made instinct a necessary but imperfect tool, one that could not be fully trusted even as it was depended upon, reinforcing the idea that avoiding risk altogether was often the more reliable strategy. There was also a broader existential aspect to the medieval night, where the boundary between order and chaos seemed to dissolve, and where human control over the environment was at its weakest. During the day, activity, visibility, and social interaction created a sense of structure. But at night, that structure receded, leaving individuals exposed to forces beyond their immediate control. In this context, a stranger was not just another person, but a representation of that chaos, an unpredictable element entering an already unstable situation. Trusting them meant inviting that uncertainty closer, allowing it to influence one's choices and potentially dictate one's fate. The reluctance to do so was not merely practical, but deeply rooted in an understanding of how fragile safety could be when removed from the frameworks that supported it. Even the idea of companionship, often seen as a protective measure, carried its own risks when extended to strangers at night. While traveling in groups could provide safety, forming such groups spontaneously with unknown individuals introduced new variables that could not be easily managed. Differences in intention, temperament, or moral boundaries could lead to internal conflict, and the lack of established trust meant that cooperation was always conditional and potentially temporary. A companion could become a competitor, an ally could turn into a threat, and the dynamics of the group could shift rapidly under pressure. This instability made even shared journeys uncertain, as the benefits of numbers were counterbalanced by the risks of divided loyalty and unclear intentions. The cumulative effect of all these factors was a worldview in which caution was not just advised, but essential, particularly in the liminal space of the night where normal rules seemed suspended. Trust in such a world was not a default state but a carefully considered decision, one that required evidence, time, and context, none of which were available in a brief encounter with a stranger after dark. The medieval individual, shaped by experience, environment, and cultural understanding, recognized that survival often depended not on boldness or openness, but on restraint and discernment. To trust a stranger in the night was to step outside the boundaries of that understanding, to take a risk that history and experience had repeatedly shown to be dangerous. And so, as the sun finally rose and the world returned to light, bringing with it visibility, activity, and a renewed sense of order, it also reaffirmed the lessons of the night. The dangers did not disappear entirely, but they became more manageable, more visible, and more accountable. In contrast, the night remained a realm where uncertainty ruled, and where strangers embodied that uncertainty in its most immediate and personal form. The wisdom of the time did not demand fear of all people, but it did insist on recognizing the conditions under which trust could safely exist. And the medieval night, with its shadows, silence, and absence of structure, was rarely one of them. Even beyond all these layers of danger, there existed a quieter, more subtle truth about the medieval night that made trusting strangers especially perilous. The way it distorted not only the world around a person, but the person themselves. Darkness did not merely hide threats. It altered perception, slowed reasoning, and magnified emotion, creating a version of reality that was less stable and far more deceptive than the one experienced under daylight. In such conditions, individuals were not always thinking or reacting as they normally would. And this applied just as much to the stranger as it did to the one considering whether to trust them. A person who might behave predictably during the day could become erratic, fearful, or even aggressive at night, influenced by the same pressures of isolation, vulnerability, and uncertainty. This meant that even if a stranger appeared harmless at first, there was no guarantee that their behavior would remain consistent as circumstances evolved, making any initial judgment inherently unreliable. The medieval night also carried with it a profound sense of finality, where every choice felt heavier, because there was no immediate reassurance of safety or recovery. This atmosphere shaped interactions in ways that made them more intense and more consequential, even if they were brief. A simple decision to speak, to follow, or to accept help from a stranger could set into motion a chain of events that unfolded beyond one's control. And once that chain began, there were few opportunities to interrupt or redirect it. Unlike in structured environments where multiple options and escape routes might exist, the night often presented limited choices, each with its own risks, and trusting a stranger frequently meant committing to a path that could not easily be abandoned. This sense of commitment, combined with uncertainty, created a psychological pressure that made it difficult to reassess situations objectively. Once a decision had been made, there was also the influence of power imbalance, which became more pronounced in the darkness. Strength, knowledge of the terrain, or even simple preparedness could shift control from one person to another in an instant. A stranger who was more familiar with the area, better equipped, or physically stronger, held an advantage that might not be immediately apparent, but could quickly become decisive. Trusting such a person meant entering into an interaction where the balance of power was unclear and potentially unequal, increasing the risk of exploitation. In daylight, These imbalances might be mitigated by visibility, the presence of others, or the ability to seek help. But at night, those safeguards were largely absent, allowing disparities to play out without interference. The passage of time itself behaved differently in the medieval night. And even when all practical dangers were accounted for, there remained an almost philosophical reason why trusting strangers at night in medieval times was so deeply discouraged. The recognition that the night stripped away the illusions people relied on to feel secure. In daylight, identity was reinforced by context. Clothing could be seen clearly, faces recognized, surroundings understood, and social roles more easily interpreted. But at night, these markers dissolved into ambiguity. A nobleman and a thief could appear indistinguishable. In the dim glow of a torch, and without the clarity of light, assumptions became fragile and often misleading. This collapse of visible identity meant that trust could no longer be anchored in familiar cues, forcing individuals to confront the unsettling truth that they did not truly know who stood before them. In such a state, every stranger became a question without an answer, and acting on that uncertainty carried inherent risk. The medieval world also lacked the concept of controlled environments that modern people often depend on, where behavior is regulated by systems, surveillance, and shared expectations. At night, especially outside fortified areas, there was no such framework to guide or constrain interaction. The absence of structure meant that encounters were governed entirely by the individuals involved, with no external force to intervene if something went wrong. This placed immense responsibility on personal judgment, which, as already strained by fatigue and darkness, was not always reliable. Trusting a stranger in this context was not simply a social decision, but a surrender of control, a willingness to rely on another person's intentions in a space where nothing compelled them to act honorably. There was also the lingering presence of unpredictability in how situations could evolve over time. A conversation that began peacefully could shift as circumstances changed. If resources became scarce, if tension arose, or if new opportunities for gain presented themselves. The fluidity of these interactions meant that even if a stranger initially appeared trustworthy, there was no guarantee that this would remain true as the situation developed. Trust once given could not easily be withdrawn without escalating conflict, and attempting to do so might provoke the very danger one sought to avoid. This created a dilemma where the safest option was often to avoid the interaction entirely, rather than risk becoming entangled in a dynamic that could turn hostile without warning. The psychological impact of prolonged exposure to darkness also played a subtle but significant role, as it heightened sensitivity to potential threats, while simultaneously impairing the ability to evaluate them accurately. Shadows could seem like movement, distant sounds could be misinterpreted, and the mind seeking patterns might create connections that did not exist. In this heightened state, a stranger's presence could trigger a cascade of assumptions, each influencing the next, making it difficult to separate intuition from imagination. Trusting someone under these conditions meant relying on perceptions that were inherently unstable, increasing the likelihood of misjudgment. In addition, there was an understanding, whether explicitly stated or not, that the night encouraged a different kind of behavior, one that was less constrained by the expectations of society and more influenced by immediate needs and impulses. The same person who adhered to social norms during the day might act differently when removed from the visibility and accountability that daylight provided. This shift was not necessarily a reflection of inherent malice, but of circumstance, where the absence of oversight allowed for actions that might otherwise be suppressed. Trusting a stranger at night therefore meant engaging with a version of that person that might not align with how they would behave under normal conditions, adding another layer of unpredictability to the interaction. The concept of boundaries also became more fluid in the darkness, as physical and social distances were harder to maintain and interpret. A stranger could approach more closely before being noticed, speak without being clearly seen, or remain just beyond the edge of visibility, creating a sense of unease that was difficult to resolve. This ambiguity made it challenging to establish clear limits or to respond appropriately to potential threats, as the usual cues that guided such decisions were obscured. Trust, in this context, required a level of clarity that the environment simply did not provide. Even the act of communication itself was affected, as voices carried differently in the night, sometimes sounding closer or farther than they actually were, and words could be lost or distorted in the open air. Misunderstandings were more likely, and the inability to read facial expressions or body language reduced the effectiveness of verbal exchange. A stranger's tone might be misinterpreted, their intentions misunderstood, and responses could escalate tensions rather than resolve them. In such a fragile communicative space, trust was difficult to establish and even harder to maintain, as each interaction was built on a foundation of incomplete and potentially misleading information. Ultimately, the medieval knight was not just a backdrop for danger, but an active participant in it, shaping how people perceived, interacted, and decided. It removed the layers of certainty that made trust possible and replaced them with ambiguity, isolation, and risk. A stranger encountered in this environment was not simply another person, but a convergence of unknowns, each carrying its own potential consequences. The caution that defined medieval attitudes towards such encounters was not born out of fear alone, but out of an understanding deep, experiential, and repeatedly reinforced, that in a world where so much could not be controlled or predicted, the safest course was often to limit exposure to what could not be known, and so trusting strangers at night was not just discouraged. It was seen as a departure from the hard-earned wisdom that allowed people to navigate a world where the difference between safety and danger could be as thin and fleeting as the light of a single flame. And beyond all these visible and psychological dangers, there was a deeper, almost instinctive awareness in medieval life that the night revealed truths people preferred not to confront during the day. The fragile nature of human safety, the thin boundary between order and chaos, and the unsettling realization that trust itself depended heavily on conditions rather than character. In daylight, trust could be supported by observation, by the presence of others, by shared routines and expectations. But at night, those supports vanished, leaving trust exposed in its most vulnerable form. A stranger encountered in such a setting was not simply judged by who they appeared to be, but by the overwhelming uncertainty that surrounded them. And in that uncertainty, even the smallest doubt carried significant weight. The medieval individual understood, often without needing to articulate it, that trust was not an absolute virtue but a contextual decision, one that could become dangerous when removed from the structures that made it viable. There was also the subtle influence of anticipation and imagination, which played a powerful role in shaping how people perceive strangers at night. The human mind, when faced with limited information, tends to fill gaps with possibilities, often leaning toward caution when the stakes are high. In the darkness of medieval nights, where visibility was restricted and knowledge incomplete, this tendency was amplified, creating a mental landscape where every unknown carried potential risk. A stranger's silence could be interpreted as concealment, their movement as intention, their presence as purpose, even when none of these assumptions could be confirmed. This did not mean that all strangers were dangerous, but that the inability to rule out danger made trust a less rational choice. Acting on incomplete understanding in such an environment was not seen as bravery, but as unnecessary exposure to risk. The rhythm of medieval life itself reinforced this cautious approach, as daily routines were structured around the natural cycle of light and dark. Work, travel, and social interaction were concentrated during daylight hours, while night was reserved for rest and withdrawal. This separation was not arbitrary but practical, reflecting an understanding of when the environment was most manageable and when it was not. A stranger encountered at night was, by definition, outside this rhythm, existing in a time when most others had retreated to safety. This alone raised questions about their purpose and intentions, as their presence contradicted the established pattern of behavior. Why were they there? What necessity or motive had brought them into the darkness? These questions, often unanswerable in the moment, contributed to the instinctive reluctance to engage. There was also the element of irreversibility tied to reputation and consequence, not just for the individual but for entire communities. If someone chose to trust a stranger, and that decision led to harm, the impact could extend beyond the immediate victim, affecting families, trade, and local stability. In tightly knit medieval societies, where relationships and resources were interconnected, a single act of misplaced trust could ripple outward, creating distrust, fear, and even conflict within the community. This broader perspective reinforced the idea that caution was not just a personal responsibility, but a collective one, where individual decisions contributed to the overall safety or vulnerability of the group. Trusting strangers at night, therefore, was not merely a private risk. And even after considering every physical, social, and psychological danger, there remained one final, almost haunting truth about why trusting strangers at night in medieval times was so deeply discouraged. The understanding that the night removed not just visibility and structure, but certainty itself, leaving people to operate in a world where cause and effect were harder to trace, and where outcomes could feel sudden, unexplained, and absolute. In such a reality, events did not always unfold in ways that could be clearly understood or later reconstructed, and this lack of clarity made every interaction with a stranger carry a weight far beyond the moment. If something went wrong, there might be no clear narrative of how or why it happened, no witnesses to confirm details, and no opportunity to learn from the experience in a way that could prevent it from happening again. This ambiguity turned each decision into a kind of irreversible step into the unknown, where the consequences once set in motion could not be easily interpreted or undone. The medieval individual lived with an acute awareness of this uncertainty, recognizing that the world, especially at night, did not always behave in predictable or fair ways. This awareness fostered a mindset that prioritized minimizing exposure to unpredictable elements, and strangers were among the most immediate and tangible representations of that unpredictability. A stranger's intentions could not be measured, their past could not be known, and their future actions could not be anticipated with any degree of confidence. Trusting them required a leap across a gap that could not be bridged by evidence, only by hope, and hope in the context of survival was not considered a reliable strategy. It was something people reserved for faith, for fortune, or for circumstances beyond their control, not for decisions that directly affected their safety. There was also the quiet recognition that danger did not always announce itself dramatically, but could unfold in small, almost imperceptible ways that only became clear when it was too late to respond. A conversation might seem harmless, a direction might appear helpful, a shared moment might feel reassuring. Yet each of these could carry subtle shifts that gradually altered the situation. By the time the full implications became visible, the individual might already be in a position where options were limited and outcomes constrained. This slow unfolding of risk made it particularly difficult to guard against, as it did not rely on obvious threats, but on the gradual erosion of control and awareness. Trust, once extended, could facilitate this process, opening the door to influences that were not immediately recognized as harmful. The medieval knight also emphasized the importance of self-reliance, not as an ideal but as a necessity. Without dependable external support, individuals had to depend on their own judgment, preparation, and restraint to navigate uncertain situations. Trusting a stranger at night, therefore, was not just a social choice, but a shift away from that self-reliance, placing one's safety partly in the hands of another whose reliability had not been established. This shift carried inherent risk, as it introduced a dependency that might not be reciprocated or honored. In a world where mutual obligation was often tied to familiarity, community, or shared identity, a stranger had no inherent reason to uphold that obligation, making any reliance on them uncertain at best. There was also an underlying awareness of how quickly situations could escalate beyond control in the absence of stabilizing factors. A minor disagreement could turn into confrontation, a misunderstanding into suspicion, and suspicion into conflict, all within a matter of moments. At night, where communication was impaired and context limited, these escalations could occur more rapidly and with fewer opportunities for resolution. Trusting a stranger meant entering into a dynamic where such escalation was possible, and where the ability to de-escalate was constrained by the very conditions that made the interaction risky in the first place. The medieval perspective on time and consequence further reinforced this caution, as people understood that the effects of a single decision could extend far beyond the immediate moment, shaping not only their own fate, but the lives of those connected to them. A person who failed to return, who lost valuable goods, or who became incapacitated due to an encounter gone wrong, did not suffer in isolation. Their absence or loss impacted families, livelihoods, and communities. This broader awareness added another layer of responsibility to decisions about trust, making it clear that the stakes were not limited to personal safety, but extended to a wider network of relationships and dependencies. In this sense, the reluctance to trust strangers at night was not rooted in a simplistic fear of others, but in a complex understanding of how vulnerability, uncertainty, and consequence intersected in the conditions of the time. It was an acknowledgement that while trust could be a powerful and positive force under the right circumstances, those circumstances were largely absent in the medieval night, where too many variables remained unknown and too many outcomes remained beyond control. The wisdom that emerged from this understanding was not about rejecting human connection, but about recognizing when and where it could safely occur. And so, as the medieval world moved through its cycles of light and darkness, people adapted their behavior accordingly, embracing openness and interaction when the environment supported it, and retreating into caution and restraint when it did not. The night, with all its uncertainties, became a space where the cost of misjudgment was simply too high to justify unnecessary risk, and where strangers, no matter how they appeared, represented a convergence of unknowns that could not be resolved in the moment. Trust in such a setting was not denied entirely, but it was withheld until the conditions allowed for it to be given with some degree of confidence, a condition that the medieval night, in all its complexity and unpredictability, rarely provided. And in the deepest sense, the medieval night revealed something profoundly human yet unsettling. That trust, which feels natural and even necessary in safe environments, becomes fragile when stripped of context. And in those hours of darkness, context was exactly what was missing. Without light, without witnesses, without shared reference points, every interaction existed in a kind of vacuum where meaning had to be constructed from fragments, tone of voice, posture, timing, none of which were fully reliable. A stranger stepping into that vacuum did not bring clarity. They multiplied the unknowns. Their presence raised more questions than it answered. And in a world where questions could not be quickly resolved, those unanswered uncertainties became risks in themselves. It was not merely that strangers might be dangerous, but that there was no dependable way to prove they were not, and that absence of proof was enough to tip the balance toward caution. There was also a quiet understanding that the night tested not just external judgment, but internal discipline. The decision to trust or not trust a stranger was rarely made in a moment of calm reasoning. It was made under pressure of fatigue, of fear, of isolation, of urgency. These conditions could push individuals toward choices that satisfied immediate emotional needs rather than long-term safety. The desire for reassurance, for direction, or simply for another human presence could become so strong that it overshadowed the instinct to remain guarded. A stranger who appeared at precisely such a moment could unintentionally or deliberately fulfill that need, making it easier to lower defenses. But medieval experience had taught that decisions made under such pressure were often the ones most likely to lead to regret, because they were shaped by vulnerability rather than clarity. In addition, there was an awareness of how little control one truly had once an interaction began. Even a simple conversation could create a connection that was difficult to disengage from without causing tension or drawing attention. Refusing a request, attempting to leave, or showing hesitation could be interpreted in ways that escalated the situation, especially if the stranger perceived it as distrust or insult. This meant that the safest strategy was often to avoid initiating or prolonging interaction altogether, because once engaged, the range of safe responses narrowed significantly. Trusting a stranger was not just about the initial decision, it was about entering into a dynamic that might not allow for easy exit. The medieval knight also emphasized the unpredictability of sequences, how one event could lead to another in ways that were not immediately apparent. A decision to follow a stranger might lead to unfamiliar terrain, which could lead to disorientation, which could lead to dependence, creating a chain where each step increased vulnerability. These sequences were not always obvious at the outset, and that was precisely what made them dangerous. Trust, once extended, could set these chains in motion, and by the time their direction became clear, reversing them might no longer be possible. The lack of clear boundaries between stages of risk made it difficult to recognize when a situation had shifted from safe to unsafe, reinforcing the importance of avoiding uncertain interactions from the beginning. There was also a broader existential acceptance that not all risks could be eliminated, but that some could be avoided through conscious restraint. Medieval life was filled with unavoidable dangers, disease, famine, conflict, but encounters with strangers at night. And if one follows this understanding to its deepest conclusion, the medieval night can be seen not merely as a time of danger, but as a condition that exposed the limits of human judgment itself, revealing how fragile decision making becomes when stripped of clarity, support, and certainty. In that darkness, people were forced to confront the fact that they could never fully know another person in a single encounter, especially when that encounter occurred under conditions designed to obscure rather than reveal. A stranger in such a moment was not just unknown. They were unknowable in any meaningful sense, because the tools required to understand them properly simply were not available. Trust, therefore, was not just risky. It was built on incomplete foundations that could not support the weight of consequence that medieval life demanded. There was also an unspoken recognition that the night equalized people in unsettling ways, removing distinctions that might otherwise guide behavior, status, reputation, and social identity, all of which played significant roles during the day, lost much of their influence once darkness fell. A person who commanded respect in daylight could become vulnerable at night, just as someone of lower standing could gain advantage through anonymity and opportunity. This leveling effect made it difficult to rely on social cues or hierarchies when assessing strangers, as those structures were temporarily suspended. Trust, which often depended on such cues, became detached from its usual anchors, leaving individuals to navigate interactions without the guidance they were accustomed to. In addition, there was a growing awareness that danger did not always come from overt hostility, but could arise from misalignment, differences in intention, expectation, or understanding that under normal circumstances might be resolved through communication or mediation. At night, however, these differences could become amplified, as limited visibility and heightened tension reduced the effectiveness of dialogue. A stranger might intend to help but communicate poorly, leading to confusion or suspicion, while another might interpret caution as aggression, responding defensively in ways that escalated the situation. These subtle misalignments could quickly transform a neutral encounter into a harmful one, not because either party intended it, but because the conditions did not allow for clarity or correction. The medieval knight also emphasized the importance of predictability as a form of safety, and strangers, by definition, lacked that quality. Familiar people behaved in ways that could be anticipated based on past experience, creating a sense of stability even in uncertain environments. Strangers, however, introduced variability that could not be accounted for, making it difficult to plan or respond effectively. This unpredictability extended beyond immediate actions to potential future developments, as there was no way to know how a stranger might behave over time or under changing circumstances. Trusting them meant accepting not just the present uncertainty, but the possibility of unforeseen changes that could alter the situation in unpredictable ways. There was also a deeper emotional dimension tied to vulnerability, as the act of trusting someone inherently involved lowering defenses and exposing oneself to potential harm. In the medieval night, where external protections were minimal, this exposure carried heightened significance, as there were fewer safeguards to mitigate the consequences if trust was misplaced. The decision to trust a stranger was therefore not just a practical calculation, but an emotional risk, one that required confidence in the other person's intentions, a confidence that could not be easily justified in such conditions. This made restraint not only a logical choice, but an emotionally protective one, preserving a sense of control in an environment where control was otherwise limited. Furthermore, the night created a context in which outcomes were often binary and immediate, leaving little room for gradual resolution or recovery. An interaction with a stranger could lead quickly to safety or danger, with few intermediate stages. And once that trajectory was set, it could be difficult to alter. This lack of gradual progression meant that there was little opportunity to test trust incrementally, to build it slowly through small, low-risk interactions. Instead, individuals were often forced to make decisions that carried significant weight from the outset, without the benefit of time or evidence. In such a scenario, withholding trust became a way to avoid committing to a path that could not be safely explored in stages. Even the concept of chance took on a different meaning in the medieval night, as random encounters could have disproportionate impact due to the absence of buffering systems. Meeting a stranger at the wrong place and time could alter the course of one's journey or life in ways that were not easily predicted or controlled. This heightened sensitivity to chance reinforced the idea that minimizing exposure to unknown variables was a key strategy for maintaining safety. And strangers, as embodiments of those variables, were best avoided when conditions were least favorable. In the end, the medieval perspective on trusting strangers at night was shaped by an intricate interplay of environment, psychology, and lived experience, all pointing toward a single consistent conclusion that trust required conditions that the night rarely provided. It was not that people believed all strangers were harmful, but that they understood the limits of their ability to discern who was and who was not, especially when deprived of the tools needed to make that distinction. This understanding led to a form of cautious wisdom, where the safest course was not to assume the worst of others, but to recognize the boundaries within which trust could operate safely. And so, as darkness settled each evening over the medieval world, it brought with it not only physical obscurity, but a shift in how people related to one another, narrowing the space in which trust could exist and expanding the realm of uncertainty. In that shifting balance, strangers became more than just unfamiliar faces. They became symbols of all that could not be known, predicted, or controlled in that moment. To trust them was to step into that uncertainty without protection, And in a world where survival often depended on managing the unknown rather than embracing it, such a step was rarely worth the risk. And if one lingers even longer in that world, imagining the slow passage of hours beneath a sky unbroken by artificial light, it becomes clear that the medieval night did not simply challenge trust. It reshaped the very meaning of it, turning what is often seen as a virtue into a calculated risk, governed by circumstance rather than intention. In such an environment, trust could no longer be based on optimism or goodwill alone, because the margin for error was too narrow and the consequences too severe. Instead, it required layers of confirmation, familiarity, reputation, shared context, and time, all of which were absent in a fleeting encounter with a stranger in the dark. Without these layers, trust became an act unsupported by evidence, a decision made in a void where the usual safeguards of human interaction were missing. There was also a growing awareness that the night encouraged a kind of detachment from consequence, not necessarily because people became immoral, but because the immediate environment created a sense of separation from the structures that normally reinforced accountability. Actions taken in darkness felt less connected to the broader world, less likely to be observed, remembered, or judged. This subtle shift could influence behavior in ways that were difficult to predict, as individuals might act differently when they believed their actions would remain unseen or unrecorded. A stranger encountered in such a state of detachment could not be easily assessed using the standards of daylight behavior, making trust an even more uncertain proposition. The medieval experience also revealed how quickly the balance between caution and vulnerability could shift. Often without warning, a person who felt secure one moment could find themselves exposed the next, simply due to a change in circumstance, a wrong turn, a failing light source, an unexpected sound. In this fluid environment, trusting a stranger introduced an additional variable that could accelerate that shift, turning a manageable situation into a precarious one. The unpredictability of these transitions made it difficult to maintain a stable sense of safety, reinforcing the idea that minimizing unknowns was the most effective way to navigate the night. Another subtle but powerful factor was the role of silence, which in the medieval night was not empty but filled with implication. Silence could mean peace, but it could also mean concealment, anticipation, or absence of witnesses. A stranger moving within that silence carried with them all of its ambiguity, their presence neither fully explained nor easily interpreted. Engaging with them meant breaking that silence, entering into a space where meaning had to be constructed without reliable cues, and where each word or gesture could carry unintended significance. This made communication itself a risk, as it required exposing intention in a context where intention could be misunderstood or exploited. There was also the recognition that trust, once extended, created a form of obligation that could not always be controlled. Accepting help, following guidance, or even sharing information with a stranger established a connection that might influence future actions. Whether one intended it or not, this connection could limit options, as withdrawing from it might provoke suspicion or conflict. And when all is said and considered, there is still one final layer to this reality that lingers like the last shadow before dawn. The understanding that in the medieval night, certainty itself was a luxury, and without it, every act of trust became a quiet wager against forces far larger than any individual could fully grasp. It was not merely about strangers being dangerous. It was about the environment stripping away the ability to confidently determine otherwise. In such a setting, even the most sincere intentions could not be reliably distinguished from harmful ones. And this blurred boundary made every encounter carry an undercurrent of risk that could not be eliminated, only avoided or embraced. Most chose avoidance, not out of fear alone, but out of a deeply learned respect for how little control they truly had once they stepped beyond the circle of light. The medieval night also revealed how quickly perception could betray reality, as the human mind attempted to impose order on an environment that resisted clarity. A stranger's presence might feel reassuring, simply because it broke the silence, because it introduced something familiar, a human voice, a shared language, a fleeting sense of connection. But that sense of familiarity was often superficial, constructed from fragments that did not necessarily reflect truth. In daylight, familiarity could be tested, observed, and confirmed over time. At night, it existed only in the moment, unverified and fragile. Trust built on such a foundation was not stable, and relying on it meant accepting the possibility that what felt safe might, in fact, be misleading. There was also an awareness that the night compressed decision, making into narrower windows, forcing individuals to act with limited information and little time for reflection. A stranger approaching did not allow for prolonged evaluation. The decision to engage, withdraw, or trust had to be made quickly, often instinctively. This urgency increased the likelihood of error, as there was no opportunity to gather additional context or seek external input. In such moments, even a small misjudgment could have disproportionate consequences. And because those consequences were often immediate and irreversible, the safest strategy was to reduce the number of decisions that needed to be made at all, by avoiding uncertain interactions whenever possible. The medieval experience also highlighted the difference between possibility and probability, a distinction that shaped how people approached risk. It was possible that a stranger meant no harm, that they were simply another traveller in need. But it was also possible that they were not. Without reliable means to determine which was true, people had to consider not just what could happen, but what was likely to happen based on past experience. Over time, patterns emerged, and those patterns suggested that encounters with strangers at night carried a higher probability of negative outcomes than positive ones. This did not mean that every encounter was dangerous, but it did mean that the balance of risk favoured caution, especially when the stakes were so high. Another subtle but important factor was the way in which control over one's own narrative could be lost through a single interaction. In the medieval world, where stories and reputation travelled through word of mouth, an encounter with a stranger could lead to outcomes that others interpreted without full knowledge of the truth. If something went wrong, the absence of witnesses or clear evidence meant that the story could be shaped by assumption or rumour, potentially affecting how others perceived the individual involved. This added another layer of consequence to decisions about trust, as the impact of an encounter could extend beyond the immediate event into the realm of social perception and future interactions. The night also fostered a heightened sensitivity to imbalance, of knowledge, of strength, of intent, and strangers often embodied that imbalance in ways that were difficult to quantify. A person who knew the terrain who was prepared for the conditions, or who had a specific purpose for being out at night, held an advantage over someone who did not. Trusting such a person meant stepping into that imbalance, relying on their guidance or goodwill, without any guarantee that it would be used in one's favor. This asymmetry made trust inherently risky, as it placed one's safety in a position that could be influenced by factors beyond one's control. In a broader sense, the medieval knight served as a reminder that human interaction is deeply dependent on context, and that when that context is stripped away, the dynamics of trust change fundamentally. It was not that people became less trustworthy at night, but that the conditions made it harder to assess and verify trustworthiness, and easier for harmful behavior to go undetected. This shift required an adjustment in behavior, a recognition that the same openness that might be appropriate during the day could become dangerous under different circumstances. And so, through countless nights and countless encounters, a quiet understanding took root, one that did not deny the value of trust, but placed it within boundaries shaped by experience and necessity. Strangers, in the medieval night, were not simply individuals to be judged on their own merits, but elements within a larger system of uncertainty, each carrying the potential to influence outcomes in ways that could not be fully anticipated. To trust them was to engage with that uncertainty directly, to accept risks that could not be measured or controlled. In the end, the lesson was not one of fear but of awareness, a recognition that survival often depended not on the ability to navigate every unknown, but on the wisdom to know which unknowns to avoid. The medieval night, with its silence, its shadows, and its absence of certainty, taught this lesson again and again, shaping a way of thinking that valued restraint over impulse and caution over assumption. And within that way of thinking, the stranger at night remained a powerful symbol, not necessarily of danger itself, but of the limits of what could be known, and the risks of acting as though those limits did not exist. And even after all these layers of understanding, one last truth lingers, quiet, almost philosophical, yet deeply practical, that in the medieval night, the greatest danger of trusting strangers was not just what they might do, but what you could no longer undo once you chose to trust them. In a world without safety nets, without rapid help, without systems to recover from mistakes, every decision carried a permanence that modern life rarely imposes. Trusting a stranger was not a reversible experiment. It was a commitment made in uncertainty, where the outcome, once set in motion, could not be paused, corrected, or safely withdrawn from. This finality gave weight to even the smallest interactions, transforming them from casual encounters into pivotal moments where caution had to outweigh curiosity. The night itself seemed to enforce this lesson through its very nature. It did not offer second chances easily. If you followed the wrong person, spoke too openly, or revealed too much, there was no simple way to step back into safety. Distance, darkness, and isolation ensured that whatever path you chose would carry you forward. Not back a stranger, in this context, was not just another human being, but a turning point, an unpredictable force that could redirect your journey in ways that might not become clear until it was too late. Trusting them meant stepping onto a path you did not control, guided by someone whose intentions and limits remained unknown. There was also a deep awareness that the night magnified consequences in ways that daylight did not. A small mistake in the day might lead to inconvenience, the same mistake at night could lead to disappearance. This disproportionate scaling of risk meant that decisions had to be made with greater care, because the margin for error was almost non-existent. Trust, which always carries some degree of risk, became especially dangerous under these conditions, because the consequences of misplacing it were not balanced by any reliable form of recovery. There was no system to catch you if you fell, only the silence of the night and the unknown that followed. In this environment, people learned to think not just about intention, but about outcome. It did not matter whether a stranger seemed kind or harmless. What mattered was whether the situation allowed for that kindness to be safely verified and sustained. And in the medieval night, that verification was almost always impossible. Appearances could not be trusted, words could not be confirmed, and actions could not be predicted with any confidence. Trusting someone without the ability to verify them was like navigating without sight, possible, but dangerously dependent on chance. Another subtle but powerful realization was that trust, once given, created vulnerability that could not easily be concealed again. The moment you trusted a stranger, you revealed something about yourself, your needs, your direction, your state of mind. This information, harmless in the right context, could become a tool in the wrong hands. A stranger who knew you were lost, tired, or carrying something valuable held an advantage that did not exist before that trust was expressed. In this way, trust was not just a risk of action, but a release of information, one that could alter the balance of power in ways that were difficult to reverse. The medieval knight also taught people to respect the limits of their own understanding. It reminded them that not every situation could be solved through interaction. Not every uncertainty could be clarified through conversation, and not every presence required engagement. Sometimes the safest response was not to seek answers, and in the very last stretch of reflection, what remains is a kind of quiet, enduring wisdom that medieval people lived by. A wisdom that did not come from theory, but from repeated encounters with a world that gave no second chances. The night was not just darker, it was a different reality altogether, one where the familiar rules of human interaction no longer held steady, and where even the smallest uncertainty could grow into something irreversible. In that reality, trusting a stranger was never just about that person. It was about stepping into a situation where too many variables could not be known, and too many outcomes could not be controlled. It was a recognition that the environment itself had already reduced one's safety to its most fragile state, and adding another unknown to that fragility was rarely a wise decision. There was also a deep acceptance that not every question needed to be answered immediately, and that sometimes the safest response to uncertainty was patience. A stranger's presence at night naturally raised questions. Who are they? What do they want? Can they be trusted? But the medieval mindset understood that seeking immediate answers in such conditions often required engagement, and engagement itself carried risk. Choosing not to engage, to let the question remain unanswered until a safer moment, was not avoidance but strategy. It was a way of preserving the ability to make a better decision later, under conditions where more information and support might be available. The medieval knight also highlighted the importance of boundaries, clear, firm limits that protected individuals from being drawn into situations they did not fully understand. Trusting a stranger often meant crossing those boundaries, allowing someone unknown to enter one's space, influence one's direction, or share in one's vulnerability. Once crossed, those boundaries were difficult to re-establish without conflict or consequence. This made the initial decision all the more critical, as it determined whether control would remain with the individual or be partially handed over to someone else. Maintaining boundaries, therefore, became a form of protection, a way of keeping uncertainty at a manageable distance. There was, too, an awareness of how easily perception could be shaped by circumstance rather than reality. The flicker of a torch, the tone of a voice, the timing of an encounter, these could all create impressions that felt meaningful, but were not necessarily accurate. A stranger who appeared calm might simply be skilled at appearing so. One who seemed familiar might only share superficial traits. The night blurred these distinctions, making it difficult to separate genuine signals from misleading ones. Trust, which relies heavily on interpreting such signals, became less reliable as a result, reinforcing the idea that decisions should not depend solely on immediate impressions formed under uncertain conditions. Another layer of understanding came from the recognition that survival often depended on reducing complexity rather than managing it. The medieval world was already filled with variables: weather, terrain, resources, health, and the night amplified their unpredictability. Adding another variable in the form of a stranger increased complexity in a way that could not be easily managed or anticipated. Avoiding that addition was a way of simplifying the situation, keeping the number of unknowns within a range that could be handled. This approach did not eliminate risk, but it made it more manageable. Aligning with the broader principle of controlling what could be controlled and avoiding what could not. There was also a quiet discipline in accepting solitude as a form of safety, even when it felt uncomfortable. The presence of a stranger might offer the illusion of security, but medieval experience taught that solitude, while challenging, was often the more predictable option. Being alone meant relying solely on one's own decisions and instincts, which, while not infallible, were at least consistent. Introducing another person meant introducing another set of intentions, perceptions, and potential actions, all of which added layers of uncertainty. Choosing solitude over uncertain companionship was not a rejection of connection, but a prioritization of stability in a context where stability was scarce. The medieval knight, in this sense, became a teacher of restraint, not the kind that suppresses action entirely, but the kind that guides it, ensuring that decisions are made with an awareness of their full implications. Trust, when given at the right time and under the right conditions, remained a powerful and necessary part of human life. But the night revealed that those conditions mattered, that trust required more than goodwill. It required context, verification, and the ability to respond if things went wrong. Without those elements, trust was not strengthened, it was exposed, and so as generations passed, and these lessons were repeated in countless forms, through stories, through warnings, through lived experience, they settled into a kind of quiet certainty. People did not need to be told explicitly why trusting strangers at night was dangerous. They understood it in the way one understands something fundamental, something proven again and again through consequence. The stranger in the night became a symbol of that understanding. Not a villain by default, but a representation of all that could not be known or controlled in that moment. In the end, the medieval world did not teach people to fear others, but to respect the limits of their own knowledge and the conditions in which they acted. It taught them that wisdom was not just about knowing what to do, but about knowing when not to act, when to wait, when to hold back. And in the darkness of the night, where uncertainty was at its greatest and consequences at their most immediate, that wisdom often took a simple, enduring form: keep your distance, preserve your safety, and let trust belong to the light, where it can be seen, tested, and sustained without placing everything at risk. And if one continues to dwell in that world just a little longer, the final and most enduring realization emerges not as a warning, but as a quiet principle that governed survival itself. In the medieval night, safety was not something you actively gained. It was something you preserved by not losing it. Every action, every choice, every interaction had the potential to chip away at that fragile safety. And trusting a stranger was one of the quickest ways to do so. Not because trust was inherently wrong, but because the night removed the conditions that allowed it to function safely. It turned trust from a bridge into a gamble, from a connection into a vulnerability, from a strength into a risk that could not be measured until it was too late. There was also a subtle understanding that the night demanded a different kind of intelligence, not one based on knowledge or skill alone, but on restraint, awareness, and the ability to tolerate uncertainty without acting on it. The urge to resolve uncertainty is deeply human. People naturally want to understand what they see, to clarify what they do not know, to engage with what appears before them. But the medieval night taught that not all uncertainty needed to be resolved immediately, and that sometimes attempting to resolve it could create greater danger than leaving it untouched. A stranger was one such uncertainty, an unanswered question that did not require an immediate answer, especially when seeking that answer meant stepping into risk. The environment itself seemed to reinforce this lesson through its indifference. The night did not guide, did not protect, did not correct mistakes. It simply existed, vast and unresponsive, leaving individuals to navigate it with whatever caution and judgment they possessed. In such a setting, trusting a stranger was not supported by anything beyond the individual's own decision. And if that decision proved wrong, there was nothing in the environment that would intervene or compensate for it. This lack of support made every choice more significant and every risk more consequential, reinforcing the idea that minimizing unnecessary exposure was the most reliable path to safety. There was also a deep awareness of how easily control could slip away once shared. The moment a stranger was trusted, whether by following them, speaking openly, or accepting their guidance, control over the situation became divided, and with that division came unpredictability. Even if the stranger had no harmful intent, their decisions, their pace, their understanding of the environment could differ in ways that affected the outcome. Trusting them meant aligning one's path with theirs, and that alignment could lead to places or situations that were not originally intended. In a world where even small deviations could have significant consequences, this loss of control was not a minor concern. It was a fundamental risk. The medieval night also revealed the importance of timing in human interaction. Trust was not just about who you engaged with, but when you engaged with them, the same stranger encountered during the day, in a populated area, with clear visibility and available support. might be approached with openness or curiosity. But at night, under conditions of isolation and uncertainty, that same person became a different kind of presence, one that could not be safely evaluated or engaged with in the same way. This shift in context transformed the nature of the interaction, showing that trust was not a fixed response, but one that had to adapt to the environment. There was, too, a quiet discipline in accepting that not every opportunity for connection was worth pursuing. The presence of a stranger might offer the possibility of help, companionship, or shared knowledge. But those possibilities were balanced